Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Master the Survey Experience. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've joined the presentation listening to your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And now I'd like to introduce Joe Ridholm, editor of Quirk's Marketing Research Review, for a few words.
Hi everybody and welcome to today's webinar, Master the Survey Experience. I'm Joe Ridholm, editor of Quirk's Marketing Research Review. And before we get started here, just a few quick notes. You'll receive an email with a link to the recording of the event approximately 24 to 36 hours after we're through here today. And there will be time for questions after the presentation, so feel free to submit questions as we go along, and we'll get to as many of them as we have time for. Our hosts today are Neil Gupta and Alex Osbaldeston. Neil is Senior Account Director at Questback, and Alex is Solutions Director at Questback. And with that, I will hand things over to Neil. Take it away, Neil.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to share the screen so that you can actually see Alex and myself, today's speakers. So let me introduce myself quickly. I'm Neil Gupta. I am Senior Account Director at Questback, heading up our research and insight function.
Okay, and click on. So yeah, I've been at Questback for a very long time, and I've helped lots of our customers in lots of different areas, whether it be market research, voice of the customer, or voice of the employee engagement type stuff. Lots of big projects that we've run over the years, and lots of little tidbits and tricks and tips that we've sort of learned along the way. And so today is all about sort of, trying to go through some of those with you in a way that's sort of easy to digest and that makes sense.
Okay, we have stopped sharing the microphone, so we can you can all concentrate on doing the slides and obviously listening to the webinar. So before we get into the real subject of today, which is all about compelling survey experiences and creating those engagements for end users, just a quick intro to those of you who perhaps aren't familiar with Questback, a little intro to who we are. So we're a software business. We support a number of industries, including market research, and that will be the key focus of our discussion today. But in total, we cover three broad audiences. We capture voice of the employee, continuous listening and employee engagement on one side, capture voice of the customer, all about customer experience on another, and then our third pillar is the capture of market data for market research and insight purposes. Okay, so I think the best way, Alex, for us to introduce today's session is to perhaps look at the creation of an engaging survey from two different standpoints. Mm-hmm. Our first standpoint is, what does an agency or an end customer who's commissioning research, what are they interested in when they commission that piece of research? What do they want to know and learn? And then I'll probably bring you in to perhaps talk from the respondent's perspective. Yeah. And we'll look at those two sides. So I'll kick off with the agency and the client side. So clients will generally commission research because they need to address a business question. And they want to ultimately drive key actionable insights that they can report back into their stakeholders, to wider audiences. And where possible, they want to capture new information that they can report back into the business, or sometimes it'll be information to validate an existing hypothesis, something that they already believe to be true, but they want to understand the market view. They want to be able to tell a story, and they want to be able to capture not only the what, but also the why, and they'll do that through quantitative and qualitative means. Now, what is it that a respondent is looking for when they participate in research?
So people generally want to give their opinion. There is obviously different things from different age groups. If we look at millennials entering the workplace these days, they are very, very happy to give feedback and want to have opportunities to give feedback very, very often. We now live in a sort of a Twitter and a Snapchat generation, and people are keen to express their opinion, sometimes over-express it if you look at Twitter. But they will do that only because it's something that's relevant to them, something that they care about, something that they feel some sort of vested interest in. It could be a brand that they have bought something from, it could be their employer, whatever it might be. But they're really only going to offer that opinion if it feels like there's, it's something that's important to them. Then in terms of your questionnaires as a whole, I think everybody knows this, but the shorter the better. But it's not just about being short, it's about being very focused. So we sort of encourage respondent experiences to be very, very close to the actual relevant point that the respondent wants to talk about. It's about asking about what you need to ask them and nothing else. There's real focus on the important stuff and not filling a questionnaire with loads and loads of fluff from lots of different stakeholders in the business. And if you can do that in a fun and engaging way, then so much better. If you can make it accessible, and by accessible, we mean meeting accessibility standards for disabled people, so you can have people doing a survey with screen readers if they're blind, things like that. These are the sort of things that we have to do to try and make it as open to as many people as possible. Now, Neil, you mentioned, it might be complex, business topics, it might be things that you want to evaluate, hypotheses. Some of those things can be complicated. So the challenge of any researcher is to drill those down into something that's actually quite easy to understand. So the clever stuff is happening in the background. And sometimes it's just clever filtering and routing and things like that. Sometimes it's about bringing in other bits of data into the types of question that you're asking and showing them something, getting them to validate something, getting them to sort of focus more in on a theme throughout a questionnaire. And doing that will also make it more interesting for them, because they'll see that you're diving deeper into the things that are important to them.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, Alex, because I think one of the main reasons for us starting and prefacing the whole session with this is that there are two different standpoints. An agency or a client, they think about what they want to get as an outcome. They don't necessarily think about how the respondent is going to engage with the content, with the survey material, and with the way that they want to gather that data. And of course, the more engaged the respondent is, the better the data that they're collecting and the better the story that they can tell. And what we hopefully will be able to get across to today is the sort of consolidation of those two viewpoints and the fact that an agency and the client can actually use very simple tips, tricks and devices using their survey software to enable their respondents to engage better with the survey they're writing. The surveys themselves, the content of those surveys, researchers will, will be their bread and butter, but actually creating a compelling experience that the respondent can really engage with is the key to really improving response and getting the best engagement possible. So let's look at some of those tips then, Alex.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing is how it looks. Sounds obvious, but it's true. People make very, very fast impressions about something. They quickly take a judgment call about whether something is something that's interesting to them and whether they want to bother with it. And it's that half a second, you look at a screen, you're looking at a website or product, whatever it is, and you're very quickly going to decide, whether this is something that you're into or not. First impressions really do count. And from the point of view of what we're talking about today, it's a design-related first impression, predominantly. There will be a content aspect, and being really, really clear up front about what's being asked of them and why is important. But to have something that's sort of compelling to look at with good graphics and good copy is a brilliant way to start. And you'll see this in every survey you do. You have more dropouts right at the start, and it sort of tends to tail off then from pages 2, 3, and 4, and down we go. And hopefully you do have very little dropout as you go further and deeper into a survey. It is actually something that we always look at it in surveys to see whether there are peaks further along the way. If you have a question that perhaps people don't understand, or even in the worst case, you've managed to create some sort of dodgy black hole of routing where people can't get out of. But it is all about that sort of first impression. How do we hit people straight up with a first page of a survey, or even the email that comes before it, of course, to make those two things something that they want to look at. So, again, we're trying to keep this simple today, and we're trying to make it stuff that everybody can do. So, first of all, we're going to think about a corporate approach. More relevant for voice of the customer type surveys than anything else, perhaps. But the idea here is to convey a sense of legitimacy. So it's got to include, your logo. If you use special corporate fonts on your website, then you should use those in the survey as well. It needs to feel very much on brand and part of the same experience, especially if it's a survey that's being popped up from a website or happening past, logging into a customer area of a website. But even without that, if you're just doing an emailing out to customers who've had some sort of event lately, then it needs to be very on brand. So the logo, the corporate fonts, the corporate colours, and also perhaps a relevant URL. So whatever the company is, .feedback or something that's sort of very, very sensible and resonates with that corporate identity.
And Alex, what's interesting I find is you and I have both been around the market research industry for a best part of 20 years now, is that still loads of surveys that we receive are, have a very plain or vanilla background. They're not on brand. It's a really straightforward thing to do using any survey tool and software, and yet it seems to be forgotten. So it's really important that is taken into account when you write any survey.
You have more scope with some software than others, but you can do something with all of them. One of the other design tips, really, that I've been doing a lot lately, and you see this a lot actually in just general website stuff, is to use a decent background image. Often the central box in a survey does tend to have to be quite plain in the main. It may have a white background, it's going to use a dark font for the questions, there's going to be some answers and some boxes to tick or something to drag around, but that's has to really focus on the question. So an easy way to brighten up the screen is to have a decent background image behind it. Something that's just, again, could be on brand, or it doesn't matter, it's just something that sort of somehow has some sort of relation to the content, and it could be as loose as possible. It just creates a nice sort of looking screen. Now, obviously, not every survey you would want to have a corporate branding on it. You might do some general research. You might be wanting to evaluate the clients and the competitors and stuff like that. You want to be very vanilla.
An independent third party kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then you need to big up that third party atmosphere. So then it's all about the agency's brand. And agencies obviously do this already. But don't be afraid to be really bold about it and really make it sort of very obvious how independent you are, but still make it look nice and use decent layouts of colours and fonts and backgrounds and things like that.
Good. Okay.
So moving along.
Yeah. So we're not going to wax lyrical about writing questions themselves, but what we will talk about for a few minutes now, Alex, is different question types and the use of different question types within a survey without going over the top and without literally using every single type of question that is known to man within one survey. That's not ever going to produce a sensible survey form. However, there are lots of really interesting out-the-box question types within all survey tools that are probably rarely used and quite simple to configure and quite simple to include. But before we go and show some examples of that, which we will do in a second, I think there's a few general rules that we would advise. I think in this day and age where data collection and a number of surveys out there, it is leading to fatigue, and it is important for brands and agencies to consider how best to generate that level of engagement with their respondents to stand out from the crowd. One of the ways to do that, of course, is to keep it on point.
Yep.
And this isn't going to be practical all the time, but where possible, for an ad hoc survey in particular, try and keep it as short as 15, maybe maximum 20 questions. I certainly learned, as a sort of classically trained researcher, the rule of thumb, 3 close questions a minute. So 15 questions about 5 minutes.
A very good friend of mine is research manager at a telecoms company, and if anybody comes to him with a survey that's going to be longer than 5 minutes for their customers, he demands a full-blooded business case as to why it needs to be that long. He really puts the effort that they have to put in to get that one through at such an enormously high level that it doesn't happen, because he knows that it's so damaging thing to do to your customer.
I think it's, if you want to keep that attention and focus and get the best data, then it's really important to make sure that you don't over-egg it with number of questions. And actually, one way of doing that is not asking age and gender 3 times within one survey. I do still see that occasionally. So one of the tips is actually to pipe responses, use appropriate filtering within surveys, and sometimes carry information that you already hold about individuals through a survey, so that you're being relevant and on point when you're engaging with a respondent, rather than re-asking the same question, or in fact asking everything when you know that you can filter in a more appropriate manner.
It can be quite common when you see it, where perhaps samples come from research panels and things like that. They're then asking some qualifications, and then they'll be validated again in the survey by who, because effectively the response has been passed from one bit of software to another for in the main part of their survey. And there's no reason why that data can't be passed through along with the respondents. It's sort of somewhat of nonsense to do that sort of thing.
No, really straightforward to do, and not used enough. Now, we need to tackle the subject of grid questions, Alex.
Yay.
Because, we're making a rather bold statement here, grid questions are always boring. Well, actually, we're going to come on and show you that grid questions don't have to always be boring.
They can make them less boring.
Now, grid questions are a very important mechanism for data capture. I don't think you can escape from using them for research purposes, because there will be a load of instances where they're completely the right type of question to use. Yeah. However, you can improve the way that they are delivered on screen to a respondent.
Yeah.
Sometimes that might be showing statements that sort of flash in and flash out. It might be, we'll come on and show you a couple of examples.
But I suppose
it's better than a matrix.
And it's partly to do with the headline of the slide, you're mixing up the question types.
Yeah.
So not to do it over and over again.
No, well, indeed.
It's really the main message, I think.
Yeah. Now, we started about talking about 15 questions or so, a 5-minute survey, if that's possible. But we did also talk earlier about understanding the what and the why. And it is important, I think, to sometimes get respondents to engage with the content of your survey through open-ended data capture. Mm-hmm. But to find the right balance for that, you don't want to be asking them every time they've responded either positively or negatively to understand why they're giving that response. I think, use open-ended questions, but use them wisely, and allowing that freedom of expression to be able to add some validity and some colour to the quantitative data you're capturing.
It's also an area where technology's starting to give us some new tricks and things to play with. So people, everyone likes open-ended questions in the data they give. They create problems, of course, in analysis, potentially. Well, I'll come to that in a second. But people tend to end up having, or I guess from a respondent's point of view, they might feel that they're both saying something in an open question and then also having a closed question to validate their answer, because there's some routing that depends on it.
Yeah.
What we're starting to see now is more opportunities for doing sentiment analysis and things like that on the fly while the respondent's moving from page to page in a survey. So you can get a sense of how they're feeling. You can even be picking out words, doing some automated coding on the fly, to then use that to drive your routing, what you ask them next. And again, that can make a survey that's actually a bit more open than closed. And respondents like open surveys because they can tell you what they want to tell you, not what you want to hear, as it were. They can sort of write their own story about how they feel. And then obviously on the back end, then text analysis is getting better and better. But it's not just text analysis for the purposes of perhaps quantifying the open data. Also start to see people using text analysis as a primary method or an additional method of generating a hot alert in a customer case.
True.
So rather than just saying, okay, everyone with an NPS score of 2 out of 10 or less, those are the ones we're going to create cases for and get back to them. Let's also use that open stuff and have a bit of a smarter feedback session with those people as well.
Good. That's a good little segue actually into our last point here, which is asking something that's thought-provoking within the survey. So what do we mean by this? I think by and large you want to keep a survey simple. You don't want to make it overcomplicated for the respondent. You want them to be able to answer something that makes sense. However, I think there are occasions during a survey when it is worth perhaps making them think a bit more about what they're talking about, because that will ultimately increase their engagement with the content. So in some cases, it might be for quality purposes as well. You might want to chuck in a question halfway through just to make sure people pay attention. Yeah, important. But actually here, I think we're talking a bit more about something that makes them want to share something back. It's, again, going back to that freedom of expression. And you touched on it just a minute ago about having something where you can code on the fly. So if you ask them something within the survey and then it produces that data on the fly, the fact that they can get to see, I mean, something like a quick poll, for example, something that they can see a response to that they've been able to engage with and seen other people's opinions for, I think is a good way of generating that level of interest, and especially if you are coming out of a grid section and you want to re-engage the respondent. It's a good device, I think, to just draw respondents back into your survey. Great.
So there we go. So let's have a look at a few sort of different ways of mixing up questions. So I want to show you a few grids, and we've deliberately chosen fairly plain and vanilla stuff here without fancy backgrounds and colours, trying to show off the functionality of anything else. So this is the first one I want to look at. What I like about this one is that the statements, and it is rotating a little bit quicker than real life, apologies, but the statements come in one at a time very, very clearly. Your focus is on this big thing in the middle of the screen. It's making you really read them and evaluate them, I think, better than your normal, typical, 5 or 6 statements down the left-hand side and a battery of buttons to the right-hand side of them. So relatively simple and nice way of doing that. This is another version. In this particular case, we can see all the statements right up front, but again, we're being asked to focus, and different sections of the screen are opening and closing. We call this the accordion. But it's another nice way of sort of showing people what they've got to do, but trying to have that element of focusing your eye on the most important thing at the time.
The thing I like about this one, this is actually quite a new addition to our set of question types, is that you can see the statements that you have already completed. So the context of the question remains. Sometimes if you flash things in across the screen, you're almost forgetting what the question was about in the first place. But here, you then get a sense of all of the key points of the question in one place.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is another one. This is not particularly, well, it is kind of a rating question. The data being collected is still a typical sort of grid-type battery here. People call this a card sort normally, but we're dragging stuff into different boxes. We can see where we put everything so far, which is a bit more novel compared to perhaps the 2 previous ones. But again, we're sort of looking at one thing at a time, and we can see all of the tasks that are required of us. And it's a slightly more interesting screen to look at than clicking through again a series of radio buttons. So it's not, we're not sort of changing the structure of people's surveys at all here.
No.
We're just trying to look at having a little bit of variety in how things are presented. And actually, speaking of variety, like we said minutes ago, I wouldn't put all of these in one questionnaire,
No, of course,
because it's just confusing and silly. But it's about having different options.
It's knowing that you don't have to show it as literally as a matrix grid with radio buttons. There are other options, which it's the same question. It's just shown in.
And actually, in this particular example, the question itself is a relatively boring question. This sort of thing works much better if you were perhaps rating different brands. And then you would have logos of the brands instead, and you'd be dragging those around. And that's actually really quite a nice looking one. We've deliberately chosen a boring one to sort of show the functionality. But it will be a lot prettier with different brands up there on the screen.
Absolutely.
Another way is obviously sliders. These have been around for ages. They're not particularly new. In this case, you can see it changes colour as you drag from one side to the other. Not that red is bad, that's just the brand's colours where I pinched this one from, but you get the idea. What's also good about this particular slider is we're actually moving away from a 5-point score. We're trying to sort of get this sentiment session sense throughout this survey, and there are lots more screens with things like this on it. So what's actually sitting behind that slider is like a 100-point data set. And it does give a little bit of extra granularity. To give you context, this was in an employee engagement survey. So normally in engagement surveys, you rate stuff from a sort of a strongly agree to strongly disagree, 5 points. And what you often find in lots of engagement surveys is that you have, you're usually reporting on the top 2 boxes, at least in the UK, probably US as well. And you don't sort of have a level of granularity within that. There's often very little scores down the bottom end. So you're sort of, really looking at tiny little bits of differences up between the 4s and the 5s, or the 4s and the 5s together. This encourages the respondents as a group to spread out their data, and that gives you some more interesting stuff to look at.
Yeah, it's more granular insight, and it delivers more of a story as well.
Absolutely. Then this one is a very simple multiple response question, I think. This is just an example of where we're using imagery as part of the questions. Obviously, when using imagery in answers, you have to be careful that they're in no way leading the respondent. So you want them all to be kind of relevant, but kind of neutral to the point. And that's sort of what we've managed to achieve here, I think. They're sort of simple little pictures, but it's just brightening up our experience. And it's presented a little nicer with boxes, that highlight up and rounded corners and stuff like that. It's a pretty little screen than just showing some checkboxes, which is of course what's really happening here.
That's right.
7 checkboxes.
And most survey tools, they'll have some sort of image media library that you can upload pictures and images, videos, etc. to, and then a very simple way of then using the questionnaire editor to just import those in, as you say, show pictures or brand logos instead of just words.
Right. And then now for something silly. So this is, well, you can see what's happening here. The idea here is that people are filling in sentences rather than filling in typical questions. This is a very silly made-up questionnaire. And I wouldn't advocate doing a whole survey like this, but in the sense of giving people something a little bit different to do, of keeping them awake in the middle of the survey, this is something that we quite like to do. So we will sometimes drop 1 or 2 of these into a survey here and there, in places where it makes sense, perhaps towards the end or something like that. But it can be a different way of getting respondents to approach a question. I mean, it is silly, but it's quite fun, and there's no harm in it.
We've made it silly. You could probably make it quite sensible.
Well,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
The right capture.
Absolutely. I mean, it has a bit of animation with the question coming down as well, which is perhaps an extra level of window dressing, but it's just another way of presenting things, really. So moving on to some of the more sort of techie parts of it, I just want to mention responsive designs. Now, everybody these days will want to do things on mobiles. We were fairly early in the game on that with Pressback, but now it's fairly old hat for just about everybody. But let's reinforce how important it is, because we've seen some industries have had a 50% mobile device usage on the surveys, even as many as 4 years ago. We have some of our customers that do a lot of youth research where the mobile response is over 80%. And it's not just the survey itself; it's the email. People are going to read the emails more commonly on their phone. It depends on the type of research, but I would go through a lot of emails on my phone, and your email itself can be responsive. Some people do this much better than others, but again, it increases the click rate by 15%. So it's worth that little bit of technical investment, so that you get the good click through, and then you have the right sort of layout for the right device that the person's using. And that's what responsive really means. I mean, literally, responsive means it's going to read the size of the screen that the respondent's using. It's going to read which way up it is, whether it's landscape or portrait, and it's going to scale and spin or whatever, adjust the question so it fits nicely on the screen. And in certain cases, even change how the question is displayed completely to make it look better on a smaller screen. And I'll show you a simple example of that in a second. But other things need to scale as well. Your logo needs to shrink down. Icons need to shrink a bit. You might need to think about the font size. Sometimes actually you would have relative to the size of the screen, that is, a larger font size for a mobile output than a desktop one, because actually it's going to end up being the same sort of size for the person's eyes at the end of the day, because people have to read these with their eyes. And I've already mentioned accessibility, so I won't go into that again.
Yeah, I think the importance of responsive design is you've outlined that very well, but I think from a researcher's perspective, the key to it is that you're fitting the lifestyle of the person that is responding to a survey, and the people's habits of how they complete surveys is just changing, and that's across all age groups. We called out the younger age groups, actually, sort of our generation, that kind of 30s and 40s. Being generous to us here. Are doing, spending more and more screen time and less sort of survey time or survey completion on a laptop with a glass of wine in hand, etc., as used to be the case. And people are just used to doing things on their phones.
And that does actually raise another point from the researcher's perspective, is that you have to also consider what you're writing as a question and how long it is. And how well it's going to fit. And
it actually makes you write better questionnaires as a result of that.
I think it probably does, or maybe it makes you create better respondent experiences. But there is, of course, the middle ground, I suppose. In our software, and I'm sure in plenty of others, you can detect what sort of device that they're using and even use that in part of your routing. So potentially you could have different questions, more long-winded, descriptive things happening on a desktop than happen on a mobile phone, rather than just starting the survey by saying, well, this survey doesn't work on a mobile phone. And I have seen that recently this year, right. Where I've seen a link for a survey, I've clicked it, and it says, no, sorry, you can't do this on a mobile. I don't see, we've actually gone to bother of clicking the link. I'd rather not be excluded, thanks.
Indeed. But I think also, just final point on this is, we need, as much as possible, to create survey environments that are as close to the moment as possible, because that's how you're going to really differentiate at the insight stage in capturing feedback that is actually as relevant as it possibly can be, as close to the moment at which that experience took place, whether it be a purchase or whether it be something that is part of an individual's daily sort of
I think the idea is you'll get more accurate data and perhaps richer data. They'll say more
exactly
because it's very, very fresh.
Yeah, good.
So this is a traditional grid now, an old-fashioned one. But to show you what responsive means in my book, I think at some point the screen will shrink as if it was on a mobile phone. There you go. And so it's adapted, and it's actually changed how the question's displayed. It's moved into a series of drop-downs. There are different options about how you can do this in our kit, but that's the idea. So it's actually reading the screen size and making a change accordingly. So that's what responsive means to me.
Perfect. Okay. Well, having shown something much more spectacular, we have to do spoiler alert for the slightly more dull section of this webinar, but an extremely important one nonetheless, Alex. So this section is all about data security, GDPR, and the importance of peace of mind as the key takeaway from here. I'm not going to go through this chart line by line. You'll be pleased to know, listening in. But the message that you need to take out from here is that it is, in this day and age, and there have been many examples of it this year, that data security is becoming hugely important to corporate reputation. And obviously, there's been a ton of work done for GDPR by every agency, by every business, to make sure that end consumers feel as if their data is safe and protected for the use, for the right use cases. So I'm just going to start on security, and maybe you could talk a little bit from the respondent side of Insight. But it's really important that that customers and respondents understand where their data is being stored, and that it's very transparent, that there are the right backups and the right kind of redundancy mechanisms in place for data security, encryption, etc. And the reason for that is because there are occasions where people are getting jittery. I was one of those. I'll give you an example. I was one of those affected by the BA data breach during a month's window in, I think, sort of late summer. And my details were compromised because I made a purchase within that particular window, and I've been monitoring my bank account quite carefully ever since then. I didn't go as far as having to change my card or whatever, but I certainly been monitoring it closely. And it'd been fine for a few weeks, and I thought, okay, fine, I seem to have got away with that. And then there was a purchase that I made recently, and I got an email through about 2 weeks after that purchase had been made saying, oh, well done, you've made this purchase. And I'd already received through the post that particular order, and I've got another email. And my first instinct actually was to worry that someone had hacked my details to make that order again because they had access to my details. It so happened that the brand had just messed up their emails and just reset the order, and it was only because I was able to tally the fact that they both had the same order number that that I was able to get over that. But it made me sit up and think and actually act on it, and that's hugely important from a personal perspective, but also, you know, within our industry. Where we are collecting huge volumes of data on a daily basis, and customers who are sharing that data want to feel that it is secure.
Indeed. And so GDPR is obviously a European thing, not necessarily a US one. But this has been perhaps the bane of a lot of people's lives in Europe for the last year, especially if you have anything to do with data. But there are some good aspects of GDPR, actually, I think, from a respondent's point of view, regardless of whether you have to follow the guidelines or not. Nowadays, in the UK, if you're going to start a survey with somebody that you haven't necessarily solicited their opinion, maybe you posted a link on Twitter or something like that, and if you're going to be collecting any personal data, which you might not be, but let's assume you are, you do have to define, you know, how long you're going to keep the data and what you're keeping the data for, and how you're going to use it, who's going to see it, and where it's going to sit, and all those sorts of things. People have the right to take their data out of it again, and who they go to if they want their name removed from something. All of that is now something we have to abide by law, and obviously it's something that software providers like us have made it very easy for people to do that. Now, obviously it has less relevance for the US, but anybody who works for a global company, a global research firm, global brand, it is something that you have to bear in mind. And honestly, I don't think that the GDPR is a bad thing from a respondent's point of view. I think there's no harm in having that same level of honesty and transparency about, you know, what you're collecting and why. Again, as part of your sort of legitimacy at the start of the survey.
Yeah, and I think the key here is that whilst it might be seen as a slightly dull or boring subject, or even slightly taboo to talk about kind of openly, the key is that peace of mind that is created. And in fact, you know, our title of the slide says embrace it, and I think that is, you know, one of the other key takeaways, which is don't hide behind it. It's not a tick box exercise. You know, we've done quite a few things on our side, as you've alluded to make our software you know, accessible from a data security and GDPR perspective to our customers, so that they feel secure in what they're purchasing. But, you know, just think sensibly about what a respondent's concerns might be, and then address them properly within a survey. Okay. Okay, now let's move on to talking a little bit more about the mixture of different modes of data capture. So I think we've largely focused on quantitative data capture up to now, but more and more surveys, it's becoming relevant to capture both qual and quant in one environment. And actually that is something that is much easier to do as well these days than perhaps traditionally. And, you know, certainly on our platform, our MR focus is very much on a series of different modules that allow you to capture data both quantitatively and qualitatively within one research platform and have that data sitting in one place. So, you know, think about from an engagement perspective whether or not you might want to introduce some sort of online pop-up community or a portal that gives you richer information that can be added to the perhaps more robust information that you're collecting in a more quantitative manner. And this can be in the form of, you know, a quick poll or a forum or a discussion group that just gives the respondent freer access to sharing their views. Now, in a quant survey, you do that through an open-end response, and then perhaps do some text analytics on it. But you can use survey software now to actually create those environments where, based on perhaps the answers that they've given in a previous survey, they might be pinged into an environment that allows them to share their views in a free way.
Yeah, they can jump into a discussion, see what other people are saying, around that same topic, sort of on the fly, automatically even.
Yeah.
And yes, a quick poll. I mean, that little poll on that iPhone picture there is much funnier if you live in the UK than probably anywhere else in the world. You may or may not have heard of Nigel Farage, and this is actually not really his Facebook page, but it was a page that's been set up to look like his, rerunning the EU referendum on whether people would want to leave or remain in the EU.
Topical.
Very topical at the moment. Yeah, we're all sort of heading to hell in a handbasket with Brexit here, but there we are. Nothing you can do about decisions of voters there. But anyway, yes, so that was nice. But even with all of this online stuff, we do have to remember that not everybody's online. Different, types of the population, it just doesn't work. And you still have to include telephone, face-to-face, and paper. Obviously, if you're going to do a full, a really open market view, you need to look to where people are, and not everybody's online.
Agreed. You have to be able to be accessible to all groups. But one thing I would add to that is sometimes qual and quant do sit as very separate ways of capturing data, and all, people have different skill sets.
Yeah.
I think
different departments.
Different departments often, who perhaps then spend a long time marrying some of that data together to tell that story back to their end customer or to stakeholders. And there are simpler ways of being able to capture qualitative data, online qualitative data, of course, we're referring to here, and marry that with quantitative data, and then tell that story in much more quickly through one platform.
Part of the research is at the outset.
Exactly. Right. Now, I think this is a little bit of a summary of some things that we've already talked about. But I would say key master tip is, by and large, keep it simple. By utilizing some of the tips that we've already told you, but in particular, maintain that quality of the data that you're capturing by thinking about the respondents, putting yourself in their shoes and thinking of exactly about how they will read your questions, and perhaps only asking questions that are absolutely necessary rather than filling a survey with a lot of additional information just because someone's asked to. Because ultimately, survey engagement is as much to do with what you're writing and the quality that the questions portray, as much as the data and the analysis that you're going to get out of it at the other end. And that also extends itself to using the right sample and different types of audience to make sure that you're capturing information from the right people, rather than necessarily sending it out to a broader, more blanket audience.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Another way, of course, of getting those responses is to just pay them for it. So this is not unusual. People know this already, generally speaking. Monetary incentives obviously can increase your response rate, but you can also do it with non-monetary ones. And so this is where I sort of perhaps spend more of my time thinking about how we can do this. In terms of non-monetary ones, we tend to sort of think about, what's the value of the respondent? Why are they giving their opinion in the first place, and therefore what value can we give back to them for them taking part? So in B2B research, this is usually often in the form of reports. They're talking about a subject that's interesting to them. They might also then be interested in finding out what other people think. Whether it's an open survey or even if it's a community of particular skilled individuals, then so much the better. They're all in it for the same sort of reason, and that report back is very much of value to them. Another thing that works in any environment, and that's what this example is on the little iPad mock-up there, is of showing the results of the story so far to respondents as they fill in the survey. And also, you're going to pick questions that perhaps aren't, the most secretive or, perhaps business critical ones. But it's very nice for a respondent to be able to see during or at the end of the survey what everybody else said. Now, in B2B, this is a really good one, because you could actually then jump them into even a one-page dashboard to be able to slice and dice the data a little bit and really get into it. For a consumer-led survey, I think it's just a simple thing. What do you think about this? And then you find out that, what your sort of rest of your compatriots thought as well. And so that's what's on the screen there. It's just showing the results to what I think is probably a grid question from strongly agree to strongly disagree on a series of points and showing the respondent what others have said.
Perfect. Okay, so this is really just to summarise the last 45 or so minutes that we spent with you, and deliver some key takeouts, some key takeaways from today's session. So we started by talking about how important it is to capture your respondents' attention at the start, through often very simple but on-brand layouts, using visual cues like logos, like background images, that just throw a little bit of colour, a touch of sparkle into a survey from the outset to make sure that you don't lose people at that stage before they've even really got into the meat of it. The next stage is sensibly mix up your question types. And that is just perhaps explore with your survey provider if you're outsourcing it, or if you've got a survey solution and tool in-house, perhaps have another look at the different question types that are on offer. And in some cases, actually, perhaps think about developing a custom question type that may address the way that you like to ask questions to your respondents in a fashion that is going to really engage them, perhaps more than using very bog standard questions, because frankly it was easy to do so. Just maybe have a think about how the respondent would answer a question based on the way that you've shown it to them. Okay, responsive design, here at Questbite, it's part of our DNA. We're very active in promoting that. It is pretty standard these days, to be fair. But that said, it's almost universal now, and it's an important consideration. Do embrace data security and privacy in the way that you communicate to your customers, and use your survey tools and the functionality and features that perhaps have been built within them to make sure that you get that point across. It only needs to get made once, but once it's made, I think they will feel more engaged. Do keep it simple where you can, but equally be thought-provoking where it's necessary. Again, that keeps it simple, but also improves the engagement. And finally, think around the different incentives for the different audiences. So it might be a monetary incentive or a voucher for taking part in quant surveys, and if you're a consumer audience in particular. If it's a B2B audience, actually they may be interested in you sharing some information back, either survey results for that particular survey, or just a newsletter or something that is pertinent to why they might have taken the time to provide their feedback. And it's big business, our industry, and some of these things are actually really straightforward to actually change the way that you engage with your respondents. So hopefully we have helped you perhaps change the way in which you approach survey design, not from the content of the questions, but from the actual look and feel of the surveys themselves. That's us for this webinar. I suppose we hand back to Joe, who hopefully has been taking some questions.
Oh yeah, we've got some good ones coming in. The first one here is, I liked a lot of the ideas you shared on engaging respondents. If you had to choose, which one would you say is most effective? After all, we can't include everything in every survey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think perhaps we definitely did hammer that point as well, which is you can't include everything. Which one is the best?
To be honest, I don't know about. I wouldn't necessarily say one question type's better than another one, but I would say I would probably put a bit more design effort into having an overall survey that looks really sweet all the way through.
Yeah.
That's probably where I go. Make it look nice, and then
So the layout side of it.
Yeah, I focus on the layout rather than the actual fancy question types themselves. And then you've got something you can reuse over and over again. So do that one first, and then build on it.
Yeah, and then the other side of that, on the questions themselves, I think we showed a variety of different matrix question types. So I would say if you've got lots of grid questions, then choose one or possibly two of those which you like best. I think that I quite like the accordion matrix myself, and perhaps use that in your surveys more than your standard grids.
Sure. I had a question here too about incentives. Isn't it possible that incentives can create response bias? For example, if some people like an incentive more than others, will that affect who responds? You know, and how do you control for the potential introduction of bias through whatever the incentive is that's being offered?
Yeah, that's a good one, and I get where they're coming from. It does make sense. I think it depends on the audience. If it's a brand doing research amongst their own customers, then there's probably little chance of response bias if the incentive is something that relates to the brand, whether it be vouchers or discount or something like that. That's probably going to be universally acceptable because they're already customers of that brand. If we're doing something that's more general market, then usually incentives in that scenario are perhaps most commonly used by the panel companies, and I think having a variety of incentives is the way forward there, and there's easy ways to do that. You have a series of back-end providers of sort of voucher codes or other third-party reward provider type people, and the respondent can pretty much choose the incentive that suits them best. So you have that variety to try and eliminate that bias. So it's not just Amazon vouchers; it's vouchers for a series of things. But it's a good question, and perhaps not one that you have to sort of carefully evaluate along the way with the type of research you're doing and the type of audits you're going after.
Sure. I can already assume that the answer to this question might be it depends, but the question is the suggestion to have 15 questions over a 5-minute survey design is helpful, but many cannot meet this limit. What would you suggest as the absolute max in terms of number of questions or minutes for a mobile survey?
I mean, I get really twitchy when you go past 10 minutes, really twitchy. I have seen stuff that's longer, but I mean, it's really asking a lot of the respondent, and it's sort of, it's potentially damaging, their relationship with whoever's asking them, or it's damaging the overall survey industry in the whole in the end. You do see surveys that are longer, but these days it is rare for them to go past 10 minutes, at least in my experience and for most of the experience of what our customers are doing. Do you have an opinion back from your days in the panel companies as well?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I used to work at Research Now before I was at Questback, and so survey length and responsive design and all of those factors for engagement were discussed at length, and lots of research done on that actually. I would agree that absolute max for a mobile optimized survey is 10 minutes. Obviously, there are loads of tracker surveys where by necessity they're going to be longer, and I think by and large most brands will accept that the majority of responses may well come from a laptop, and that we would almost encourage respondents to take their time over that and almost tee that up at the start of a survey. But I think the question related specifically to answering it on a mobile, in which case I would say an absolute max threshold of 10 minutes.
Okay. I had a question too about this section where you were talking about piping, and they had a question about how that increases. Could you go back over again, talking about how that increases completion rates?
So it's something that we've noticed and done a little bit of playing with, and there's independent research that we can perhaps dig out and maybe forward as part of this. I can't remember who did it, but if you think about it from a logical point of view, piping, we're bringing in potentially respondents' answers to previous questions or other data that we know about them. And so if you take this sort of blank thing about increasing response rates, we're demonstrating to them that we've understood what they said so far and we're asking them to elaborate on it. Or we're making sure that we're focusing them on the specific thing that they bought last, and that was a teapot or whatever it was. And so that's sort of, it's a way of personalizing the question to the respondent. and therefore makes it easier for them to answer. It also makes it easier to read, because if you have to write things in a very generic sense, you sometimes end up in a place with rather sort of stilted English, or possibly even bad grammar. So I think and that's why it's only a small increase. It wasn't a huge leap.
No.
But it is that sort of subtle improving of experience that then leads to that response rate increase as well.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, the piping of relevant information that they've already shared within the survey makes the experience for the respondent better, which then in turn leads to more of them wanting to complete the survey. So, in a typical survey, you will see dropouts all the way through a survey, and often it's at the beginning because you're screening people out. Other times it's genuinely because they've lost the will early on, because they're being asked something repetitively. Like I shared the example of sometimes you get age and gender about 3 times. Then there are definitely ways in which you only need to ask that question once. And yet there are a lot of examples of surveys where piping and filtering, appropriate filtering, is just not implemented in the right way in order for a questionnaire to flow as well as it could. So, and these are, we're talking about sort of small tweaks here. We're not saying that you should be capturing every response from Q1, Q2, and Q3 and trying to pipe them all the way through to Q4, Q5, and Q6. It is more a case of just using that functionality within every survey tool, which is a very simple piece of functionality to pipe information like that, just to use that more effectively in survey design.
Sure. I think we've got time for just one more here, and this looks like a good one. What are some of the worst rookie errors you've seen in survey design?
Okay. Golly, what's been the howlers? So, well, to be honest, being told I couldn't do a survey on a mobile earlier this year did annoy me. What else have I seen recently? I think actually that the worst rookie principle is to not be relevant to the respondent and to ask them about stuff they don't care about. To get them to answer, a huge battery of stuff that's not necessarily relevant to their experience with the brand or however it might be done. Trying to sort of drag them through something. I mean, I could get on my soapbox and complain about conjoint as well, but that's not really a rookie error. It's just something I can't stand.
Yeah, well, we'll leave that one there. I think the worst I've seen recently actually links back to the dreaded grids. I had about, it must have been about 8 grid questions in a row.
Yeah.
Now, if you have to use grids, and we said a number of times that they are an excellent way of capturing data and necessary a lot of the time, but don't put them all together.
Yeah.
Break the survey up to to increase and improve the flow, but also just to make sure that your respondent's sanity is not completely wiped out. So these are small design tips, but if you've got a battery of questions that you need to cover off, image questions or personality questions or importance and performance questions, whatever they are, just start with a battery early on and then come back to some of them later on.
Actually, I'll do one more little rookie error that really only relates to employee engagement. It's something that people fall down. So if you're going to do a massive employee engagement survey with a big company and you're going to send an email to all the staff, you need to make sure that you check with the IT people in every single country or division or whatever that they haven't blocked your bloody link.
Because it happens to spam.
Exactly. It still happens all the time. So that's another one.
Right. Well, we are almost at the top of the hour, so I think that's all we have time for today. But I'd like to thank Neil and Alex and everyone at Questback, and also, most importantly, all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. So thanks very much for being with us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.